I was halfway through brewing my morning coffee when the lights blinked twice, the security system beeped its death rattle, and my voice-activated assistant stuttered to silence. I looked at the screen above my kitchen island, offline. Entire house, no signal. At first I thought it was a freak storm, or maybe a power glitch, until my emergency line rang with a tone only one department ever used. The local police. A dispatch officer's voice cracked through with panic. "We've lost all backup systems. Ethan, your link is down." Then came the words that made my heart stop. "We're blind out here. Your network was the only relay we had left." My Wi-Fi system wasn't just personal, it was the emergency failover for the entire police station. And someone had just severed it with garden shears. Standing smugly at the base of my repeater tower, still in her floral robe, was Karen Wentworth, HOA tyrant and amateur saboteur, holding the cut wire like a trophy. I never asked to be part of the HOA drama. I bought my house on Cedar Hill for the quiet, the space, and the excellent tree coverage that made setting up rooftop hardware easier than anywhere else in the county. I worked as a cybersecurity consultant, government contracts mostly, some commercial clients on the side, and I needed a reliable, private, high-bandwidth connection. So I invested in a repeater tower and established a line-of-sight bridge from my roof to the city's emergency communications hub. A side deal with the city allowed my link to serve as backup for the local police station's dispatch, in exchange for a tax rebate and a small monthly stipend. Most people thought it was just a fancy antenna. Nobody knew its real purpose. Especially not Karen. Karen Wentworth had been the self-elected queen of the HOA for the last 4 years. She hosted meetings at her house, enforced rules she often made up on the spot, and printed citations on letterhead she designed in Microsoft Paint. The woman hated everything she couldn't control. Halloween decorations, music after 5 p.m., wind chimes, and apparently now, Wi-Fi towers. Her vendetta began a few weeks ago when she knocked on my door holding a manila folder labeled radiation exposure. She claimed my equipment was causing her migraines and affecting the migratory patterns of bird. I calmly explained that my setup was fully licensed and regulated, complete with FCC compliance report. But her ears closed the moment my mouth opened. The following week, I found notes taped to my mailbox. Then came the fake violations for things like improper fence symmetry and unauthorized LED lighting. At one point, she claimed my motion-detecting owl statue was a surveillance drone. It would have been funny if it weren't so persistently annoying. Still, I stayed polite. I never retaliated. I figured she'd lose interest and move on to the neighbor with the gnome collection. I was wrong. The morning she cut my tower line, she acted like she'd done me a favor. She stood beside the now sparking junction box and said I should thank her for reducing the harmful energy waves around the neighborhood. I didn't respond. I couldn't, because my phone lit up again, and this time it wasn't the police. It was City Hall. Their IT director, panic in his voice, demanded to know why their law enforcement link had gone dark. I didn't even finish my coffee. I grabbed my tools and jogged to the tower, inspecting the damage. It was worse than I thought. The cable wasn't just sliced. The terminal box had been pried open with what looked like a screwdriver, leaving gouges in the housing and exposed circuit. She hadn't just cut the line, she'd smashed the hardware that managed the data packet. I couldn't even run a diagnostic because the junction's onboard chip was fried. As I stood there, Karen asked if I was going to thank her for cleansing the airwaves. I gave her a look I usually reserve for malfunctioning malware. Then I walked away. The next few hours were chaos. Police cruisers rerouted to my block. Officers, many of whom I'd worked with quietly over the years, asked technical questions while neighbors peered through curtains. I showed them the damage. I pulled up the system logs, displaying the exact time the tower lost signal. It all lined up. The outage corresponded precisely with the backup link failure at the station. Karen, meanwhile, had slipped inside her house, refusing to answer the door. By noon, the precinct was running on analog radios, and dispatch was working off cell phones. One officer, clearly under pressure, asked if I could restore the system immediately. I told him the repeater needed to be replaced entirely. That wouldn't be easy. The original was custom-built and calibrated for the city's frequency range. I had spare parts, but the alignment and sync process would take hours, maybe more. The officer sighed and said something I'll never forget. "You wouldn't believe how fast things spiral without that signal. Domestic calls missed, backup delayed. Someone's going to get hurt." That hit me harder than I expected. I wasn't just angry. I felt responsible. Even though I hadn't done anything wrong, I knew the consequences of downtime better than anyone. That's why I'd spent so much time and money making sure the link was reliable. It had been flawless for years. Until Karen, in a fit of pseudoscientific madness, decided she didn't like the look of my antenna. Later that afternoon, I saw her out on her porch talking to someone. A younger man with a tablet, maybe her grandson. They were pointing toward my house and laughing. I narrowed my eyes. I had a bad feeling there was more going on than Karen simply hating Wi-Fi. Maybe this wasn't just a random act of suburban foolishness. Maybe someone had convinced her to do it. Someone who knew how critical the system was. I called a contact at the city's IT department and asked for the error logs from the backup server. We scanned the timeline together. Something odd popped up. There was a short spike in outgoing traffic just before the tower went offline. Not much, just a burst. But enough to suggest that someone may have accessed the network remotely before it was severed. That wasn't Karen. That was someone with intent. By evening, the temporary patch I rigged got the system partially online. Dispatch was relieved, but jittery. They didn't trust it. The captain called me directly to ask when the full link would be back. I told him I'd have a new repeater fabricated within 48 hours. He thanked me. Then he asked one more question. Should we press charges? I looked out at Karen's house. The porch lights were blinking erratically. Her No 5G Zone sign was now taped over her mailbox. I imagined her sipping chamomile tea and browsing conspiracy forums while the neighborhood simmered in confusion. I thought about it long and hard. Press charges? Oh no. Not yet. I had a better idea. The sun had barely risen the next morning when the first of the fallout calls began pouring in. I was still rebooting auxiliary routers in the garage when my phone buzzed with a call from Officer Luna, someone I'd worked closely with during the implementation of the backup network. Her voice was tight with frustration. 3 domestic violence calls had been delayed by over 20 minutes during the outage. One of them resulted in a hospitalization. Another suspect fled the scene before backup arrived. The station's main grid had suffered a cascading update failure, and without the repeater, they'd been left scrambling. Karen's petty vandalism had real consequences, and people were hurt. I walked back into the house as my home system slowly crawled back online. The kitchen display flickered, showing a spotty connection but enough to begin restoring basic services. I pulled up the diagnostic logs and reviewed what little telemetry had survived the outage. The logs confirmed what I suspected. There was a 14-second window between the first power loss and the full severance of the signal. During that sliver of time, an unknown device had connected to my node. It had used a spoofed MAC address and tunneled a small data burst out through my uplink. A digital fingerprint. Someone had used Karen's chaos as cover to ride my network like a wave and push something out, fast. It wasn't Karen. The tech profile was too deliberate. She might be dangerously confident in her ability to trim hedges and bark orders at Amazon drivers, but she didn't have the skill or knowledge to initiate packet injections. Someone else was in on this, and they used her as a willing distraction. I flagged the burst for deeper analysis and began running forensics through my sandbox environment. Simultaneously, I sent a sanitized copy to my contact in the city's digital response team. They owed me favors, and the situation now included public infrastructure sabotage. As I waited, I made a fresh pot of coffee, staring out the window toward Karen's home across the cul-de-sac. She was standing in her yard again, clipboard in hand, wearing a sun hat and oversized sunglasses like she was on a beach rather than a crime scene. She was scribbling notes and measuring something against the fence between us. A tape measure in one hand, her phone in the other. That was her next move. I knew the rhythm. She'd shift the narrative from what she did to what I supposedly violated. Property lines. HOA codes. She was probably building a fake report on my landscaping next. I took a sip of my coffee and opened my HOA member portal out of morbid curiosity. Sure enough, there was already a digital complaint filed under my address. Suspicious cyber infrastructure disturbing wildlife and neighbor wellness. Attached was a photo of my repeater tower, zoomed and filtered dramatically, as if it were a nuclear warhead. Karen had wasted no time spinning the story. She always knew how to twist a situation until she looked like the victim, even when she was the one wielding the wire cutters. But this time, her nonsense was already bleeding into bigger consequences. Around noon, the city's IT response team confirmed the source of the spike. The data burst had pinged a shadow server tied to a notorious conspiracy forum that specialized in doxing government contractors and municipal employees. This wasn't just a random internet hiccup, it was intentional, targeted, and damaging. My system had been weaponized in an active attempt to breach local law enforcement communications. I didn't just need to fix the network, I needed to expose who had used it. I ran a trace on the spoofed MAC address. It led to a familiar ID block, consumer-grade, custom-labeled gear commonly used in private developer kit. The brand name was attached to a user alias I'd seen once before, WNet Dev Grayson. My mind clicked. Karen's grandson, Grayson Wentworth, had once bragged at an HOA barbecue about designing encryption-breaking apps and hosting hackathons in his garage. He was in his early 20s, angry at the world for not being a billionaire already, and obsessed with the idea that the government was hiding tech from the people. I hadn't seen him in months, but this smelled like his brand of stupidity. Suddenly, the sabotage made sense. Grayson knew about my infrastructure. He probably saw the repeater, asked Karen about it, and she gave him her usual delusional account. To him, my network was a target, a way to break into something bigger or prove some twisted point. But instead of just hacking it, he convinced Karen to physically sever it, removing the risk of any logs or automated traces. Unfortunately for him, my system was smarter than he assumed. Even in partial collapse, it logged every single interaction, including his. The police returned to my property that evening, this time with a different tone. After reviewing my evidence and speaking with city officials, they were no longer seeing this as a neighborhood spat. This was now classified as critical infrastructure tampering. Karen, of course, was nowhere to be found. She'd gone to her sister's house for peace, as she posted on her Facebook group. Her caption read, "When toxic neighbors ruin your spiritual balance, retreat and protect your aura." The comments were a mix of sympathy and suspicion. But Grayson hadn't gone anywhere. Officers visited Karen's house and were greeted at the door by Grayson himself, wearing earbuds and holding a gaming laptop. The moment he saw the police, he turned to run, but one of them was faster. They tackled him on the porch and found not just the laptop, but a USB stick filled with packet-sniffing tools and several folders labeled with names of HOA residents. Some of the files even included private Wi-Fi passwords and device histories. He'd been scanning multiple homes, not just mine. While the officers secured the evidence, I received a call from the city's cybersecurity coordinator. They wanted a meeting in person. Apparently, this had sparked more alarms at the state level. There was now concern that other similar tech sabotage incidents could be coordinated, and I had just provided a blueprint of how to track it in real time. They asked if I'd be willing to help expand the monitoring framework. I agreed, partly out of civic duty, and partly because I wanted to make sure Karen never had another opportunity to wreak havoc. The next day, a formal report was released to the community. The city acknowledged that a criminal act of sabotage had disrupted emergency services. While they didn't name Karen directly, the photo used in the article clearly showed the remains of my tower, and her floral glove lying in the dirt beside the cut cables. The neighborhood buzzed with speculation, but it didn't take long for word to get out. Several neighbors who'd previously tolerated Karen's antics began asking pointed questions in the HOA message board. One even demanded a vote of no confidence. Despite this, Karen refused to apologize. She issued a rambling video message claiming she was only trying to protect her community from electromagnetic threats, and accused the city of overreach. She even hinted that she had legal advice pending, which was code for she'd watched a YouTube video about sovereign citizenship. Grayson, meanwhile, had been detained and was under investigation for unauthorized network surveillance and criminal hacking. By the time the sun set on the third day since Karen's now infamous garden shear stunt, the neighborhood had transformed from a quiet suburban haven into a hive of whispers, side eyes, and nervous tension. Word spread faster than Wi-Fi signals ever could. No one could believe that Karen's little crusade had actually taken out the emergency fallback for the local police station. But that wasn't even the most disturbing part. What really shook people was the discovery that someone, Grayson Wentworth, had piggybacked on the chaos for something far darker. That he had used the confusion to try to breach private networks, and that Karen had unknowingly enabled him, lit a fire under everyone. Suddenly, this wasn't about HOA politics anymore. It was about trust, about safety, about how much one entitled person could unravel when she had no clue what she was actually doing. Karen, meanwhile, had gone full bunker mode. She had stopped showing up to HOA gatherings, locked her social media, and even changed the welcome mat on her porch to say, "Do not knock unless you have a warrant." It was ironic considering the police had, in fact, shown up with one. I'd been told they searched her garage and seized multiple devices, an old laptop, some half-functional routers, and even a hand-drawn schematic of my house with the words "illegal frequencies" scrawled across it in red ink. But none of that compared to what they found in Grayson's room. His personal rig had been custom-built to intercept signals and bypass home firewalls. His code was messy but aggressive, scripted to find unsecured devices and compile data logs. He wasn't a genius. He was reckless, and my repeater system had been his stepping stone. What made it worse was the realization that this wasn't his first attempt. Based on data logs retrieved from the USB drives in his backpack, Grayson had been scanning local traffic for weeks. He had mapped the networks of nearly a dozen homes in our area, using a combination of spoofed addresses and short-range attacks disguised as guest devices. The police confirmed it. Karen's sabotage of my tower wasn't random, it was deliberate, because it allowed Grayson to cover his tracks just long enough to send a data burst out to a shadow server. What exactly he sent was still under review, but the fact that he tried to do it during a known police system switchover window suggested intent. Not the kind of thing a court would overlook. The local news caught wind of the story when a patrol car was spotted outside Karen's house for the third time. A photo made the front page of the county paper with the headline, "HOA Horror Show, Cyber Chaos in Suburbia." A few more details emerged in the article. Karen's unauthorized entry onto private property, Grayson's tampering charges, and my role in supplying emergency signal support for the city. Almost overnight, I went from being the quiet tech guy at the end of the street to the dude who caught the hacker with receipts. Some neighbors sent over cookies, others sent apology texts, and a few, like Mr. Ray from across the street, simply said, "Didn't realize we had a whole Jason Bourne thing going on over here." But Karen didn't go quietly. No, she tried to launch her counteroffensive. She filed a formal HOA complaint against me, this time with accusations of violating antenna height restrictions and unauthorized government affiliations. She claimed my repeater tower wasn't just ugly, it was a national security risk. I laughed when I read it. Not because it was funny, but because it was exactly what I expected. When entitled people feel cornered, they don't apologize, they escalate. That escalation came to a head at the next emergency HOA board meeting. It was held at the community center, with more attendees than ever before. I showed up with my laptop, a small projector, and a neatly printed binder of documentation. Karen stormed in 20 minutes late wearing a shawl, oversized sunglasses, and a neck brace. Apparently, stress had manifested physically, and she demanded the meeting begin with a moment of silence for her nervous system. No one obliged. She took the floor immediately and launched into a dramatic tirade about neighborhood health, how technology was poisoning the birds, and how I was secretly working with agencies to track everyone's smart thermostats. She said my tower was not just a repeater, it was a surveillance pylon. Several people rolled their eyes. A few others looked confused. But no one interrupted her. That was my job. When she was done, I connected my laptop to the projector and calmly played a series of security cam clips, one showing her climbing the tower ladder, another of her yanking the wire, and finally, a time-stamped server log showing the exact moment her actions triggered a cascade outage across 3 municipal departments. Then I displayed her own grandson's code files, his Mac spoof traces, and the intercepted packet headers. There was no arguing anymore. It was undeniable. She wasn't a victim. She was a catalyst. The board was stunned. So were the residents. A retired firefighter stood up and asked why Karen hadn't told anyone her grandson was running a private hacking operation out of her garage. A young mother asked if her smart baby monitor had been affected. Someone else demanded to know if any personal data had been stolen. Karen tried to deflect, claiming she was protecting everyone and doing what the government won't. But the room wasn't buying it anymore. She had lost them. Then came the surprise. The police chief himself showed up at the tail end of the meeting. He addressed the room briefly, confirming that the city was working closely with investigators and that further charges were being evaluated. He also said something no one expected, that the city was considering expanding its backup infrastructure by partnering with other tech-enabled homes in key neighborhoods. He pointed to me, said my network had bought them precious time during past emergencies, that without it, more people would have been hurt. The room applauded. Karen turned a shade of red I'd only seen once before, when she caught a kid drawing with chalk on the sidewalk. After the meeting adjourned, a spontaneous conversation started about removing Karen from her post. According to the HOA charter, if more than 60% of residents signed a vote of no confidence, she could be replaced immediately. Someone passed around a clipboard. It filled up faster than the community hot tub on the 4th of July. By nightfall, Karen was in full meltdown mode. She sent a mass email claiming she was being smeared by shadow operatives and that the meeting was rigged. No one responded. Grayson's case was moving forward, and based on the forensics, he'd be facing serious charges. I had given all my data to the authorities, but I kept a few logs to myself. Not for revenge, just for documentation. In the meantime, I focused on rebuilding. I upgraded my repeater to a next-gen mesh node with quantum-level encryption and a 360-degree tamper alert. I even installed a secondary optical uplink with private cloud sync. It was overkill, but it wasn't just for me anymore. This neighborhood needed protection from threats both outside and inside. Karen had treated technology like a weed to be yanked. I treated it like a lifeline to be reinforced. The irony wasn't lost on me that while Karen was screaming about invisible waves, her grandson had been weaponizing them. The problem wasn't the technology, it was the ignorance, the refusal to understand before taking action. And now, thanks to that ignorance, she stood not only disgraced, but possibly liable for aiding in a cybercrime. As I looked over my freshly restored network that evening, sipping coffee in the cool breeze, I couldn't help but smile. She thought she could cut me off. She thought she could shut me down. But all she did was plug me into a bigger fight, and I was just getting started. The neighborhood buzz was different now. It wasn't the usual chatter about lawn lengths or potluck schedules. It was heavier, more electric, like something important was unraveling right in the middle of our idyllic little cul-de-sac. In the days following the HOA meeting, the no-confidence petition to remove Karen had picked up momentum like wildfire. The clipboard had turned into a digital form. Then someone printed flyers. Then someone else made a website. By the end of the week, over 70% of the HOA members had voted in favor of removing her. She hadn't just lost control, she'd lost relevance. But Karen was never the type to walk away quietly. Instead of accepting the vote, she declared it invalid. She claimed that since it wasn't conducted through official HOA channels, it was technically null. Then she doubled down by filing an emergency injunction at the county clerk's office to stall the leadership change. To everyone's shock, it was temporarily granted. Somehow, through some legal loophole in the HOA bylaws, she managed to cling to her position, for now. Her defiance was matched only by her delusion. She issued a memo to the neighborhood stating that foreign actors had infiltrated the HOA through technological trickery, and that steps would be taken to secure all communication lines in accordance with national integrity protocols. It was like she thought she was the head of Homeland Security, not the volunteer president of a suburban block association. But while Karen tried to wield power like a weapon, the community was growing immune to her drama. People stopped showing up to her emergency meetings. They started ignoring her emails. Even the board treasurer, an old friend of hers, quietly stepped down. There was a shift in the air, something bigger than a grudge. People were waking up. They saw what happened when power was abused by someone who thought the rules didn't apply to them, and they were done playing along. I hadn't intended to become the face of this transformation. Honestly, I was just a tech guy who wanted his bandwidth back. But after the public meeting, after the police and the city officials stood by my side, people started asking me questions. Real questions. About how the system worked, what security measures I used, and whether it was true that other neighborhoods were installing similar failover networks. One of the board members approached me quietly and said they were forming a new oversight committee, something practical and transparent. They asked if I'd be willing to help draft the technical framework. I said yes, not because I wanted to lead, but because I knew what could happen if someone like Karen ever got her hands on power again. Meanwhile, Karen tried to win back the neighborhood in the most Karen way possible, by hosting a restoration picnic in her backyard. She printed glossy invitations and claimed the event would include a speech on community healing and electromagnetic neutrality. Barely anyone showed up. Those who did told me it was awkward, tense, and oddly paranoid. She gave a rambling speech about the dangers of invisible infrastructure and then introduced her latest project, a decorative rock garden shaped like a Faraday cage. One neighbor texted me afterward and said, "Pretty sure she's just building a tinfoil shrine to her own ego." The turning point came one rainy Thursday afternoon when a delivery truck clipped a telephone pole at the edge of the neighborhood. The power flickered. Cellular signals dropped. The main grid was briefly compromised. But for the first time in 3 days, the police dispatch didn't panic. They had full access to their systems. My newly upgraded repeater, now hardened and backed by a municipal contract, kept the link alive. The failover system worked exactly as designed. Later that night, the city's emergency communications director sent a thank you email, carbon copied to the mayor and several council members. I didn't ask him to do it, but he did it anyway. That email made its way into the hands of the HOA, and suddenly, Karen's narrative collapsed under the weight of real facts. At the next public town hall, Karen tried to reassert her authority. She stood at the podium, clutching her clipboard like a life vest, and accused the entire neighborhood of turning into a surveillance state. She said I had installed government spyware under the guise of civic safety, and that the only reason people supported me was because they were brainwashed by internet dependency. But then something extraordinary happened. A mother from the block, whose daughter had nearly been injured during the blackout because 911 was delayed, stood up and called Karen out. She said the system I built had saved lives, and that Karen's lies had nearly cost them. Then a retired paramedic spoke. Then a schoolteacher. One by one, people voiced their support, not for me specifically, but for truth, for accountability, for common sense. Karen's voice got louder. Her claims got wilder. She started invoking conspiracy theories and accusing City Hall of a smear campaign. But this time, no one was listening. They were watching. And they were voting, right there, in person, with their presence, their words, and their silence. When she realized she'd lost them for good, something cracked. Her face stiffened. She dropped her clipboard and walked off the stage without another word. The next day, a special meeting was held to ratify the removal vote officially. This time, it followed every legal requirement. The paperwork was flawless. The votes were counted by neutral observers. Karen was formally stripped of her position, and an interim board was elected. They were a mix of professionals, parents, and level-headed residents. People who didn't want to control their neighbors, just represent them fairly. Karen's house has been strangely quiet ever since. No more memos. No more yard meetings. Her grandson Grayson was still under legal investigation, and her emails had stopped altogether. The garden she once used to stage her wellness speeches was overgrown. The Faraday Rock sculpture remained, but it now served more as a strange neighborhood landmark than anything else. Kids dared each other to touch it, claiming it would make their phones lose signal. I found it funny. A fitting symbol, really. With Karen gone, I turned my focus back to strengthening the system. I began training others in the neighborhood on how it worked. We formed a volunteer tech group, an informal emergency task force that could handle outages, respond to unusual signals, and ensure no one would ever be left disconnected again. The city provided minor funding, and we built redundancies into the system. Our repeater wasn't just a signal anymore, it was a symbol, a reminder that the neighborhood could thrive when people collaborated instead of competed. In the end, the showdown hadn't really been about Wi-Fi or HOA codes. It had been about control. About what happens when someone who doesn't understand a system tries to dominate it out of fear. Karen had cut a wire she didn't comprehend, sabotaged a network she didn't believe in, and unleashed chaos with the confidence of someone who'd never been challenged. But now she'd been challenged. And defeated. Not by force. Not by revenge. But by fact, logic, and the collective will of neighbors who had finally had enough. It didn't take long for the story to spread beyond our neighborhood. The combination of a rogue HOA president, a sabotaged police backup system, and a hacker grandson was just too juicy for local news to ignore. Within a week, an article appeared with the headline, "Wi-Fi War Ends, HOA Reign of Terror." The piece was surprisingly fair, recounting how a neighborhood's backup internet relay helped prevent a wider emergency during a city network failure, and how the person responsible for cutting that lifeline was none other than the HOA president herself. They didn't even need to exaggerate, it was dramatic enough on its own. Photos of the severed tower cables, police reports, and Karen's chaotic public outburst were more than enough to tell the story. Then came the emails. Some from nearby neighborhoods asking if I could help them build similar emergency signal systems. Others were from tech blogs curious about how I designed a mesh relay durable enough to survive sabotage. I didn't consider myself some kind of hero, I just built a system that worked and kept it running. But apparently that was rare enough to be newsworthy. I answered the emails one by one, offering advice and resources. I didn't charge anything. I wasn't doing this to start a business. I was doing it because I never wanted to see another neighbor panic when emergency services went dark. The city invited me to a council meeting as a guest speaker. I wore a blazer over my usual jeans, stood behind the podium, and explained how simple neighborhood infrastructure could be repurposed for emergency use. I spoke plainly, avoided the tech jargon, and emphasized the importance of trust, something our old HOA leadership had squandered. The mayor thanked me in front of everyone and announced a new initiative to support homeowner-led safety network. I didn't expect applause, but it came anyway. It was surreal. 1 month earlier I'd just been trying to stop my motion sensors from pinging me every time a raccoon passed by. Now I was consulting on suburban resilience policy. Karen didn't at the meeting. She had stopped showing up to everything, even when legally entitled. Her legal team had advised her to stay quiet while the case against Grayson proceeded, and while no criminal charges had been formally filed against her yet, she was no longer the HOA president and no longer welcome in any official capacity. Some said she might move away, start fresh somewhere else. Others joked she was probably inside building a Wi-Fi-proof panic room. No one really knew. Her blinds stayed shut. Her house felt like a bunker now, dark and silent, the opposite of what it once was when she patrolled the sidewalks like a mall security guard with a clipboard. Meanwhile, the neighborhood had changed in ways that were subtle but profound. There were fewer fines, fewer complaints, fewer passive-aggressive notes taped to trash bins. The interim board had opened communication channels, hosted a casual block party, and even created a shared Slack workspace for updates. I was asked to moderate the tech channel. We discussed everything from storm-proof routers to portable battery stations. It felt like a community again, not a dictatorship. Grayson's case became a kind of cautionary tale. The court proceedings were quiet, mostly sealed, but I heard through a city contact that he had struck a plea deal. His access to the internet would be limited under supervision, and he was required to complete community service focused on digital safety education. Ironically, he would be helping teach teens not to make the same mistakes he did. It wasn't prison, but it was accountability. I was okay with that. I didn't want to destroy the kid. I just wanted him to understand that actions have consequences, especially when they affect more than just you. One afternoon, while upgrading the solar array that powered part of my relay station, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned and saw Karen standing on the edge of my driveway, arms crossed, her eyes shaded by oversized sunglasses. For a moment, neither of us said anything. She looked thinner, older, like the stress had finally worn her down. She glanced up at the antenna, then back at me. I waited. Eventually, she said something that surprised me. "You win," she muttered. "The neighborhood chose you." I didn't respond right away. I could have said 100 things. I could have reminded her of the chaos she caused, the system she broke, the lives she endangered. But instead, I asked one question. "Did you ever think to ask what it was for?" She looked down, then back up. Her lips tightened. "I didn't trust it. I didn't understand it. And that made it dangerous?" I asked. She hesitated, then nodded. "I guess so." That was as close to an apology as I was going to get. And honestly, it was enough. I didn't need her to grovel or cry. I just needed her to understand that her fear, her need to control things she didn't comprehend, was the real danger. She turned and walked away without another word. I watched her go, wondering if that brief moment of clarity would stick, or if she'd retreat back into paranoia. Either way, it wasn't my battle anymore. A few days later, the new HOA board officially removed all of Karen's old ordinances, including the ridiculous anti-technology clause she tried to pass. They replaced it with a new framework. Residents had the right to install safety infrastructure as long as it didn't pose legitimate physical harm or interfere with others' property. It was fair, balanced, and long overdue. I helped write part of it. That night, a group of us gathered at the community center and toasted with lemonade and barbecue. We didn't celebrate Karen's downfall. We celebrated our own empowerment. For the first time, the HOA didn't feel like a club of gatekeepers. It felt like neighbors watching out for each other. As I walked home under the glow of the street lamps, my phone buzzed. A message from the police station. They just completed another test of the emergency link, and it passed with flying colors. The chief added a short note, "Thanks again for stepping up when others couldn't." I smiled and typed back, "Always online. Always ready." Weeks passed. Life settled. The repeater worked perfectly, even during a series of nasty summer storms that knocked out several transformers across the city. Our neighborhood didn't miss a beat. One evening, I saw two teenagers riding bikes near Karen's house, daring each other to touch the infamous Faraday Rock structure she had built. One of them claimed it gave him static powers. I laughed from the porch. The rock remained untouched, weird and out of place, a silent monument to one woman's paranoia and the chaos it almost caused. And yet, I didn't feel bitter. I felt something else, something closer to relief. Because in the end, this wasn't just a story about Wi-Fi or HOA power trip. It was a story about understanding, about community, about how easy it is to fear what you don't know, and how important it is to ask questions before swinging the shears. Karen may have started this war, but she didn't finish it. We did. Together. As neighbors. As people. As a network not just of data, but of trust. The last thing I did that summer was install a small wooden sign on my fence near the repeater. Just 4 words carved clean and simple. In case of emergency, neighbor powered. No fancy logo. No dramatic slogan. Just the truth. And that truth, it turned out, was stronger than any signal Karen could ever cut.